Hi guys, this is a Unit 3 review video, and we will be covering Chapter 7, which is all about conflict, and Chapter 8, which is all about stress. So aren't they so appropriately matched, correct? So all right, let's get started. Looking in Chapter 7, conflict. And sometimes, students, when I teach this class in person, I've noticed that sometimes students aren't that excited about a chapter on conflict, but I hope after reading the chapter and watching this video that you will feel more equipped to deal with conflict, since we all have conflict in our lives in different shapes and forms. Sometimes, of course, in our family, in our workplace, even in our classrooms and our social groups. So it's not something you can really avoid, but what I would hope you get out of this chapter is that you are better able to manage conflict and that you have more things in your toolbox. So my goals for the video, I don't always meet my goals with time, but it's only 2 chapters. Chapter 7 is a little shorter, and so I'm hoping to get Chapter 7 done in about 20 minutes. And Chapter 8, I think, will take maybe 30 minutes. So total length should be 50 minutes or shorter, let's hope. All right, so let's get started with conflict. So conflict is defined in your book as an expressed struggle, yes, that involves at least 2 people who perceive the situation, meaning they are interpreting, they're viewing it in a different way, and they're experiencing interference from the other person. There's something the other person's doing that's keeping you from achieving your goals. There's usually 6, these categories can be 6 different types of causes for what's causing the conflict. It could be that maybe you're struggling over who should have control of the resources, like who should manage the money. Maybe it could be that you have differences in preferences and you just chemically just don't match, right? Okay, the chemistry is not there. It could be that you have obvious value conflicts where your values are clashing. And same goes for beliefs. So what you believe is clashing with one another. Maybe you have completely different goals. Maybe you're in a relationship, but you're having a lot of conflict because one person has the goal of just being comfortable and staying home and being safe, and the other person likes to live on the edge and wants to be doing things every day that are different and challenging, etc. So you definitely could definitely lead to conflict. Finally, the last one is just, it's sometimes just the nature of the relationship. Is maybe that you started off in conflict. Maybe there's somebody in there who likes it and who likes rousing up, the conflict. And so that could be just part of the relationship, or it could be another situation where it's just that's who fights. It could be the defendant and the prosecutor, and that's a situation where obviously there's conflict because of the nature of the relationship. So sometimes, you wonder, well, what's involved here? Some people view that kind of conflicting relationship just as a matter of roles. So for example, managers with their employees, sometimes they view, like, the manager says, well, that's going to be the nature of our relationship, is to be having conflict. So and sometimes you really need to revisit your definition, because a manager should not, by definition, constantly be in conflict with his or her employees. You're actually there to guide them and support them, and so that requires you coming back and redefining your role. All right, moving on. Let's move on to the next slide. So conflict can have many effects. Most people notice the negative effects of conflict. They usually point out that they don't like conflict because somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose, or that it can lead to resentment, or that it can build up larger problems, like you started a little fight here and now people show up with backup forces and you have a bigger fight. And so most of the time people are familiar with the negative effects of conflict, and that's what they usually can bring to mind when we talk about the effects of conflict. But one of the things I would like for you to get out of this chapter is that there can also be very positive things that come out of a conflict. Conflict isn't always bad. It does depend on how it's managed and what kind of things are allowed. But properly managed conflict can actually bring about growth in a relationship. It can also help each party discuss and express their feelings and get them out, right? Which can be part of, mental health. And then also it can increase your motivation and your self-esteem when you see that you were able to positively resolve a conflict. And so I would tell you to keep your mind open about conflict and, not just view it as a negative thing, but also understand that, hey, if it's managed properly, good things can come out of conflict. Your book goes into 3 different behavioral styles of managing conflict. The first one is the passive person, the person who manages everything passively, also called non-assertive. And then we're going to look at the opposite to passive, which is aggressive, and that person tends to use a lot of hostility in their management. And then we have the third category, which is called the assertive style. So let's look at each one of these. So now a passive style, this person is usually very self-denying, which means they don't allow themselves to express what's really on their mind. They don't allow themselves to really say what they feel. They can be very, very indirect, and they're very emotionally dishonest. They'll say things like, yeah, it's great. And you'll hear it in their tone, but they're still saying yes, they're still agreeing. And so this is someone who's learned that conflict is really bad, and that, we should always be in harmony, that, you need to please everyone, right? Okay. And that you definitely need approval from everybody. So they don't want to be the one who's rocking the boat. They don't want to be the one who's like, the devil's advocate, that's horrible to them. They view that as a problem, or someone who likes to just, build trouble, right? So okay, so what's the point of being passive? Well, this can definitely look good among others, because they'll say, oh, you're so nice, and they, you don't really get blamed for anything because you never really took a stand on anything. Other people might view you as so selfless, that you're just always giving, and that you're so easy to get along with. And so if this is a description of you, I would say you might need to ask yourself, am I passive? Do I get to express my actual opinion, or am I very self-denying and hold back and don't really express what's really on my mind? There are disadvantages to being someone with a passive style, and that would be, first of all, that your needs never really get met, and other people don't really know what you need. And sometimes this person is a little passive aggressive as well, because sometimes, even though they're not saying things up front, they still expect people to read into and read between the lines, and kind of, well, you should have known, an ethical person would have known that this didn't feel good to me, or whatever, right? Okay. And so they can, expect miracles from other people, like, why aren't you reading my mind? And also from there, they can build up a lot of resentment, and they can get very angry. And that's what it means to be passive aggressive, is that you're not saying anything up front, but then later on you're angry, when people don't take you to the restaurant you actually wanted to go to, even though you didn't say that you wanted to go to that restaurant. Right? So careful with this style, right? And if this is you, I'm hoping you will have your ears open for what is preferred to a passive style. and it's coming, and it's definitely not this one, right? Okay, so the aggressive style of conflict management, this is the person who's, kind of grown up with thinking that in order to stand up for your own interests and your own rights, you have to attack other people, you have to intimidate them, you have to overpower them and ridicule them, and exert your power and control over them, or you're going to be seen as weak, or as a wimp, and that's the only way to win. Right. Okay. And so what I would say to that is, yeah, it can have some advantages, like people are scared of you and they, will think, well, I'm not going to cross her path. But, they will make you think you're in control sometimes. The problem is that if they feel humiliated, or if they feel that they're on the defensive, or they feel resentful towards you, they're not really going to want to go to you. They're not really going to trust you. And sometimes they do set you up for failure. They might work behind your back. They might, group up and build, a consensus against you. And so you don't want to use this method. This method is very popular in our country. Unfortunately, we are known as having highly aggressive style. And I would say that it's not the best way to operate in the workplace. It's not the best way to operate in a relationship. And, it can look like you've got it together, but in reality, people sometimes really do sabotage you when you are someone with an aggressive style. Okay, so what is a style that's preferred and that's recommended? Well, it's about being able to defend your own rights without having to violate the rights of others. So, just by standing up for yourself, you don't have to put someone else down in order to stand up for your own ideas and your own voice. This is someone who, considers how they make other people feel. They're honest in their reactions, they're direct, they, respect their own stance and their own position, and they express it, and they're straightforward. But they do this while showing respect for the other person. And so, sometimes we learn that either or, and we learn this either or thinking, which is really problematic, in logic, is either or thinking, because often, that's assuming that there's only two options. So people who use an aggressive style is almost like they're saying, either I make myself known as the boss, or I'm going to get run over. There's so many other options possible, right? Okay, but they don't consider all the other options. They're just kind of seeing the world as if it's black or white. And so we have to recognize that there's other options, and there is a way to uphold your own opinion and express it without having to tear down other people. So what are the advantages of having an assertive style? Well, definitely these people have more fulfilling relationships. They report more fulfilling relationships. They're also able to feel good about themselves, and they carry themselves with confidence, and they tend to have higher self-esteem. Some of the disadvantages, though, is that you are being honest, you're being straightforward, you're being more direct. And so sometimes people are offended by that. Some people might be hurt by that, and it might disappoint others, And so it's about learning how to express yourself with tact. And, there is the right time and the right place for the way you want to say things. And, it's that nuance of knowing when can this be said. And, not everything has to be, said all at the same time, or, and, there's definitely not something that can be said every single time. So for example, if you're arguing and emotions are heated, and you continue to say things that are really triggering the other person, then, at that point, it's wise to step back and say, why don't we cool off? It's not that you're having to deny what you're expressing, but it's just not the right time to say it, right? So it's also about, how to say it and when to say it. There's some nuances, right, in human interaction. So maybe when I talked about passivity, maybe that struck home with you. Maybe it struck a chord with you because maybe that's something that you have issues with. Maybe you tend to be very passive, and maybe a lot of times, and it can be a cultural thing, in our Hispanic culture. Sometimes in El Paso, we have like 80-90% Hispanic culture. And so we are known often for being somewhat passive, and it is a more what's the word I'm looking for, collectivistic, right? It is more collectivistic. And so when you have cultures that are more collectivistic, they tend to also be a little more passive because they kind of uphold the group versus the individual. And so maybe you're having to learn how to be more assertive. And, this can go against your cultural norms. It can go against your family's expectations. Maybe it goes against the workplace, is that, you should just be passive and do what you're told. But, there is a way to be more assertive. And again, upholding the rights of others and respecting others while you're able to express your own thoughts and feelings. So first of all, standing up for your rights and expressing your feelings. Remember, I told you that it's about tact, though. You want to use tact. You want to use emotional intelligence as you express, what you are feeling. It is good to express positive feelings as well as negative. Your book is going to say just express positive, but hey, the whole point of being assertive is sometimes there are things that you're going to say that are negative and that are judgmental or critical. And, those are things that you have to realize, hey, is this worth it? Is this something I need to say? Is anybody hurting if I don't say this? I always say, if you're going to say something negative, right, okay, make sure that it is sandwiched between a series of positive statements. And, the ratio of positive to negative is important. We do like to hear great things, but, it's powerful. One negative thing can outweigh so many positive things. So you got to keep that in mind, that negative statements that you say, and more I'll hear students say, hey, I'm blunt. I just say what's on my mind. And, it's, if they don't like it, too bad. And that's who I am. And, that might sound like it's a strong value and a great virtue to have. But I would say that part of emotional intelligence is knowing how to read people and knowing that you can express certain things, but that you have to do it with tact. And it is a matter of learning how and when to express those feelings. One thing that can put people's guards down is using I messages, and that's, as opposed to using you messages. So when you do this, you do that, you are this. Those are all things that can put people on edge and make them more defensive. So by using I messages, it tends to kind of deflect that and make them less guarded and possibly more open to what you were saying. So, try using I messages. Try, saying things like, I feel that, right? Okay, this was hurtful to me. And let me explain why I found it hurtful. Instead of saying, you did this, and, especially when you use labels, like when you say you're such a loser or you're always late and always, right? And when you do these things that are just very judgmental and very all-inclusive, it can create a lot of defensive feelings. So try using I messages, and also always be open for a response. Say, do you agree? What do you think? This is what I felt. What did you feel? And that can, also deflect defensiveness. And then Sometimes you just have to say no, and that's something that I have several friends that struggle with that, and sometimes put themselves in really difficult situations because they're trying to please everybody. And so, just learning how to say no, you can say it nicely. You don't have to be ugly when you say no. You can say it, with tact again and with emotional intelligence. But, just being able to say, honestly, I have so much going on that day, I'm not going to be able to help. I wish it was a different day, or maybe it's just something you're not interested in, and actually saying to someone, this is something that's outside of my interest, and I would prefer not to participate in this, but I am open to blah, right? Okay, so, it's important to be able to say no. And, when you're a student and you have a lot of stuff on your plate, it is very easy to say no, but many of you struggle. And, being able to say to someone, hey, I have a test, I have a paper due, I have an assignment, and, if people hear from you enough that school is your value and your number one goal and that you want to graduate, they're going to be more understanding when you say no, and you back it up by saying, I have this paper or I have an exam to study for. But you just have to make it very clear to everyone in your life that this is a goal, a very important goal to you that's near and dear to your heart. All right, let's keep going. All right, so there are obvious differences in conflict management. We can see them even from childhood. Boys tend to be more directive and give orders. Girls tend to make more requests. And this is the same in management. Boys, as men, tend to give more orders, and women tend to make more requests. And so often men are described as kind of being obsessed with power, and women are much more likely to want to take care and monitor and maintain a relationship. So those are some differences that we see. And, when we look at the differences in research on what women do as far as leadership, women tend to be much more participative leaders, where they, and democratic, where they involve more opinions, and they want to keep the relationships going. And so sometimes they're judged as weak because of that. But, men, when we look at Fortune 500, we have about, out of the Fortune 500 companies, we have about 493 of them that are run by men. And we look at all the struggles that often are faced in these organizations because men do focus on power, and because they do give directives. Often they're not worrying about relationships, and they're not listening often to the people below them. And so, stay open, right? Okay, stay open to these differences. Another big thing is cultural differences. And I mentioned a little bit about the Hispanic culture in El Paso, but also we have a difference in context. So there are high context cultures and there are low context cultures. And low context cultures, which is what the United States is known for, being more low context. And so in that situation, you rely more on like the actual writing. Like, for example, on a resume, you look more at what's there, right? What's the explicit language on the resume? And from there, you don't really put it into context. You don't really put it into like the persona. I've seen people get hired sometimes just because they had a resume online, electronically on some platform. And, that is unheard of in a high context culture. So a high context culture is going to value like self-restraint. They look into a lot of the nonverbal. They want to put your resume, your qualifications into context of, who you are and how you get along with other people. They might want you to go out to eat with them. They might want you to go play golf with them. So that's a high context culture. Like the Japanese are very high context in their culture. And they're going to go and they want to make sure that you're going to be more of a conversational person, someone who knows how to get along and that values relationship, and not just, take it out of context and look at your qualifications and hire you based on that and, your probability of fulfilling a goal. All right, so finally, this is hopefully one of the most important things that you get out of this chapter is that what is the best way to resolve a conflict? And, when I usually ask this question in class, in my face classes, students have heard the C word, and that C word is compromise. And they have learned that, compromise is the best way to solve a conflict. I'm here to tell you it's not, right? Okay, so let's look at what are the options that we have next time that we're in conflict. What are the options? We have many options for resolving a conflict. And, they're not always going to be the best in all situations. So we have to learn, like, okay, there is a time and place for each of these, right? Okay, so let's look at that. Okay, the first one is avoidance. Right? Okay. And avoidance is where you just decide, I'm not going to deal with this conflict. And at that point, you just ignore it. Right? Okay. And you decide, I'm just going to be passive about it. And I'm just going to ignore it. Now, that can definitely be a problem if it is a situation that needs to be dealt with. Right? Okay. If it's a conflict that's, hurting you, causing you some kind of strife, you see that it's growing and it's getting worse, and you choose to just ignore it, then obviously that is not appropriate. Now, avoidance is appropriate in certain situations. For example, if it's minor, it's trivial, and it makes no difference to you in the long run. And you do have people who tend to make big deals out of tiny little things. And, if that's the case for them, sometimes I have to wonder, well, what are you going to do when big stuff comes your way? Right? Okay, so, avoidance can be appropriate in certain situations. But, the problem there is realizing, well, maybe it's minor to you, but not minor to somebody else. Right? So, when you do see and notice a conflict, I would challenge you, about ignoring it and just being passive. I would challenge you to really question, hey, could this, even though it's maybe looks trivial to me, could it be something big to somebody else? So notice in parentheses here that avoiding is a lose-lose strategy, which means both parties are going to lose when the conflict is completely ignored. The next type of strategy is accommodation. And the accommodating strategy is where you basically give in to the other party, and you say, okay, you know what, have it your way. Do what you want, and I'll just, I'll take one for the team or whatever. And the problem with that one is it is a lose-win situation. And if this was, again, something important to you that you care about, it's going to build some resistance for you. It's going to hold back. It's going to hold you back, in some form or fashion. And possibly it's going to get worse. And so you definitely don't want to resort to that in all situations. Now, someone might ask me, well, when is accommodation appropriate? Hey, if it's somebody's birthday and they want chocolate cake and you don't like chocolate, but it's their birthday, then at that point, it's appropriate, right? Okay, you lose, they win, and maybe you can get yourself a cupcake or something, right? Okay, but there are certain situations when this is completely appropriate and it's okay to give in to the other party. But you have to learn how to be a good judge of that, correct? You have to learn with wisdom. You have to weigh the options and see, hey, is this the best thing? Because sometimes, we just kind of give in because we're lazy, or we just don't want to give the mental effort, or, the emotional effort putting up a fight for something. But if it's important to you, I would say then don't use this strategy. Right, the next one is competing or the forcing strategy. And in this situation, this is where the person resorts to aggression, right? And just forcing something upon the other party. What would be considered an autocratic attempt. Like, I'm going to decide this, I'm calling it, and here we go, and this is what we're going to do. And at that point, maybe the other party had some concerns that are not being addressed by your strategy. Maybe they're not being addressed, or maybe they're actually being hurt by your strategy. So at this point, this would be looked at as maybe you win because you got what you wanted, but they lose. But it could also be a lose-lose, because at this point, if you force a solution onto other people, there's probably going to be resentment and it's going to come back and bite you, right? Okay, so, we just want to be careful with using this strategy. Now, like I said, the aggressive types often think this is what they have to do. They think this is the only option. They think if you don't force a strategy, then you're basically turning over and giving in. So they think there's only two options. And what I'm trying to teach you is that there's many more options, and there's actually something even better than compromise. So, all right, so let's see. Now, item number 4, a compromise. Well, like I said, a lot of times students will say this is the solution when there is a conflict. But compromise means that each party has to give something up. So you have this give and take, and not everybody gets what they want. You have to cooperate, and you have to kind of both give up something. So this is what's called a partial lose-lose. You don't both get what you want. And so through a compromise, it's kind of like we're sitting there, we didn't get exactly what we wanted, but we got a lot of what we wanted. And so sometimes people feel this will suffice. Now, sometimes this is great compared to like a forcing strategy where one party completely loses, or compared to accommodating where you completely lose. So sometimes people consider this as the best option. But what I did want to teach you from this is that there's something even better, and it's called collaborating. And collaborating is where you work together to actually get what both parties want. And you might say, well, that's impossible. Well, no, see, it is going to take some time. It's going to take some effort. But, full collaboration is possible. So I do give the example of what if you were, fighting for, maybe you were a business and you were fighting for a certain corner lot that you wanted to place your business on. And there was somebody else who's also fighting for it. And you go into this bidding war maybe, and you're fighting financially, trying to win that corner. And in reality, if you win it, they lose it. If they win it, you lose it, right? Okay. Or you could compromise and say, okay, well, how about, you lose it this time and I lose it next time? But what if you both put your forces in and said, what if we both got the corner? Is there a way for us both own that corner, both have access to those clients, and both succeed? And so at that point, you really have to strategize and see, could our businesses exist together on this corner lot? And if so, what are the advantages? So what are the advantages of, let's say, for example, having a Long John Silver's and an A&W on the same corner? Well, think about it. Maybe, there's people that are okay with Long John Silver's going and having a meal and the whole family is okay with it. But think of like, you have friends who have differences. And sometimes people are like, I don't eat fish and I don't like greasy stuff, but I sure could go for a root beer float, right? Okay, so, collaboration, and this is like a really basic example of it, but it's just, getting you to think, hey, is there a win-win? And is it possible? And I say it is, but a lot of times we just don't want to make the mental effort. We don't want to give it the time and the resources that it's going to take to actually come up with a win-win strategy. So hopefully now you know that compromise is not the best solution for handling a conflict. The best all time would be, hey, we all win, correct? Which is collaboration. I hope you add that to your toolbox for next time you have a conflict, and you can think, okay, am I going to lose? They win? Are they going to win? I lose? Or are we both going to lose? Or is there a way that we could all have what we want? And, I know that it sounds impossible sometimes, but I would tell you to work a little harder when it's something worth fighting for. All right, so for having this win-win solution, here's just some quick steps. So first of all, defining the problem, because sometimes, we think we're onto something when in reality we haven't really achieved a full analysis of the problem, and we're not really at the root of the problem. Sometimes we're just kind of looking at the symptoms of the problem. So really, really pick that problem apart. And then share the problem, discuss it with one another. Here's why this is a problem to me. How is it on your end? And listen to what they're needing. And then how can you all solve the problem in a creative way, and putting your heads together to be creative. And then from there, what might be the best solution and the one that's going to best fit the win-win criteria for both parties involved. And then, it's always a trial and error. We have to put it into practice and we implement a solution. But maybe we come back a month later or a year later and we find out it's not working, or it's not really benefiting both parties equally, and we need to make some changes. So, looking for win-win is something I hope you learned out of this chapter. And there will be times when conflicts just can't be resolved, and that would be that, sometimes you just have basic belief or basic value clashing. And those values that we got sometimes since we were little, and our parents put them into our value system, and they're not going to go away, we're not going to budge, and there we are fighting. And sometimes people will tell you, like, don't argue about religion, don't argue about politics. But if you're learning and you're open to objectivity, then you should keep an open mind, because now you're seeing what I'm telling you, that there is a way to resolve conflicts with a win-win situation. And so try to be more open, try to really explore, why am I not budging on this? Why is this so important to me? Why is this so core to me, right? Okay, and really, really question why you're just so dead set on having it, stay a certain way. And then maybe sometimes there's just no solution for something, and it can't be solved, or it's not something that's going to be solved easily. But can you agree on a baby step? Can you agree on a starting point? Can you agree on a platform? Maybe there's too much that's out of your control, and there's just stuff that just can't be resolved because it's out of your control. And I think sometimes we say that, but in reality there are things that are in our control. Those 24 hours and how we manage them in a day, they're in our control. So I would say question yourself again when you say that's out of my control. Remember the internal and the external locus of control person. And if you're an external, then you probably think everything's out of your control, right? Okay, and then maybe there's just, because of policy, things have to be a certain way and you can't change them. But see, again, there I am thinking, well, maybe it's time to address policy changes, right? Okay, all right, well, that was chapter 7. All right, and now let's move on to chapter 8. And I think I'm a little over time already. So hopefully chapter 8, we can go through it. And it's a topic you're very well and dear to your heart, which is stress, right? And there's no absolutely widely accepted definition of stress, right? Okay, but you might define it in some of these ways, like how much demand is made on an organism to adapt, cope, or adjust. It can also be defined as the rate of wear and tear on your body. I would add on your mind, right? Okay. And then another one would be the anxious or threatening feeling that comes when you interpret something or you appraise something as being more than what your psychological resources can adequately handle. There are various types of stress discussed in your book. There's eustress, which is a good kind of stress that gets you going, like maybe it was the stress that got you to sign up for college, or the stress that gets you finally writing a paper, etc. So that's the good stress, right? The one that gets you going and gets you creative and that you're enthusiastic for. But then there's distress, and the distress is the one that can be very negative or harmful because it actually is stretching you beyond your capacity to cope, right? And hyper stress, is definitely overload. So that one is where they just pile up on each other and they really exceed, your overload. They exceed your ability to cope. And then there's hypo stress, and hypo stress is not having enough stress, and you're just sitting around bored and lacking stimulation and unchallenged, right? So that would be the underload, as opposed to hyper stress, which would be the overload. The causes of stress are various. You can have obviously various life events, like for example, things that you anticipate, like you're getting married next year. Okay, well that's coming. It's an anticipated event, and you know that it's going to involve a lot of stress, right? Okay, then there's the unexpected things that happen. An unexpected illness or an unexpected car accident, or anything that just is not expected and that really changes your life. Getting downsized at work, getting laid off. Those are all things that can definitely be unexpected and really catch you off guard. And then there's the accumulating events, and all those things that just kind of build up on each other. So how many of these life events did you have happen within the past year? Now, this is our pandemic year, right? So we've had so much stress beyond what a normal year would present. And then maybe added on to the pandemic, maybe you've had several things pile up, on top of that. Maybe you've had, God forbid, but you've had a loss of a job, or, loss of a loved one. Imagine how many people have lost their loved ones through this pandemic. So those are all things that can build up on you and definitely lead to more stress. And then there's the beautiful daily hassles. And, if you're still having to go out there and go to work every day physically show up, you're having to drive, with traffic. These are the irritating things, standing in the line, having to wait, those are all things that, some people have very high issues with. I usually ask in my classes, who hates standing in lines? Who hates traffic? Who hates having to pay the bills? Who hates having to, help kids with homework? And those are the daily hassles. And, there is no getting around those. They happen on a daily basis, right? Now, part of your stress, though, is also how you assess that stress in your head, your cognitive appraisal. So, do you perceive it as something that is threatening to you? Do you perceive it as making a demand on you? And also, do you feel that you're not adequately prepared for it, that you don't have the resources necessary so that you can deal with that threat? And I'll let you read that one on your own, but it's just mainly a poem about your thoughts and how your thoughts can work for you or can work against you. The effects of stress were studied in stages in psychology. And, initially we only viewed stress through the eyes of fight or flight. And so, as your body prepares to fight or run away when it sees a threatening stimuli, like a bear coming at you, it kicks in that sympathetic arousal that, triggers your heart rate to start beating faster. Your breathing increases because you're trying to get oxygen to your appendages like your legs and your arms so you can run or you can fight. And so that was initially how stress was viewed. But then there was a guy named Hans Selye, a researcher, and he actually identified these three stages of, general adaptation syndrome. And so he said, well, fight or flight is just part of the alarm stage. That's the first stage when you're first alarmed. But then he noticed that, there were people who were having this stimuli on a regular basis. So if you can picture yourself working in a very stressful environment, or like for example our soldiers who are at war and who daily face the fear of being attacked on a daily basis, our police officers or our Anybody who deals with something that is very stressful on a regular basis, or it could be someone who's like in an emotional, abusive and a physically abusive relationship. That could also be someone who's consistently being exposed to that stressor. And so what Selye found is that if you're consistently being exposed, then you go beyond fight or flight and you enter what he called the resistance stage. And this is where your immune system triggers the second pathway that involves the corticosteroids, specifically cortisol. And at that point, cortisol is triggered as backup forces to help you recover and to help you stabilize. But if you know anything about cortisol and the corticosteroids, they are long-term immunosuppressors. So what that means is they will suppress your immune system. They're long-lasting as opposed to the fight or flight catecholamines like adrenaline. Instead, the corticosteroids have long-term effects, and therefore when they get released, they stay in your system for a longer period of time, and they suppress the immune system. So once we suppress your immune system, you are vulnerable now to any illness, including a common cold, and it can get you really, really sick. And so through the exhaustion phase, that's where you can definitely see yourself getting sick from stress. As far as the physical effects, we see 3 out of every 5 doctor visits being stress related. We see almost 90% of reported illnesses and disease as stress related. We see that 1 out of every 3 Americans has considered quitting their job because of stress. And that there are many physical effects. The list is lengthy, but just to name a few, headaches, backaches, ulcers, common colds, gastrointestinal stuff and indigestion, fatigue, insomnia, aching back, hypertension, vomiting. I mean, there's so many different ways that stress can get a hold of you physically. Behaviorally, there's many things that it can do for you. It can cause you to, tighten your jaw. It can cause you to go into depressive bouts or into a deeper depression. It can make you irritable. It can make you act out violently. It can make you impatient. It can make you eat more or eat less, sleep more or sleep less. It can change your, drinking habits. It can change your temper tantrums. It can give you apathy where you sound like you just don't care, right? Okay, and you don't. True apathy is where you just don't care. And sorry, guys, my dog is barking. And let me see, boredom, fears, all kinds of stuff, right? Doesn't that sound like fun, right? And so, yeah, it can definitely wreak havoc on your behaviors as well as your physical effects. Now, it also has to do with like your personality type. So, in psychology, we've studied various types of personality types. We have the type A, who's very competitive, they're very irritable, they want to succeed, they're very impatient, they have trouble with relaxation, they tend to be perfectionistic, they want everything now. Even when they're relaxing, they tend to be pressured and clock watching. They, don't respond to their bodies when they're doing long hauls at work or excessive working. They don't respond and they don't give in to, hey, this is time to rest, you need to get some sleep, you need to take a little break. They don't tend to do that. They thrive on stress. They're adrenaline junkies. They never finish work. There's always something to be done. They like a fast-paced lifestyle. They also can get hostile sometimes. They can be, they look high strung, they look hyper, they're scattered sometimes. They eat fast, they walk fast, they talk fast. And yes, I tend to be very type A. The only thing I don't do as much is I don't resort to hostility. Now, they have learned that you could be type A with or without hostility. And so I don't resort to hostility as much, but I do to be very, very time driven. So, I do all of the above. eat fast, walk fast, talk fast, all of those. And sometimes, I have to tell my students, guys, I'm not on crack or cocaine, I promise, right? Okay, I'm just very high strung, right? Very high strung, very fast paced. My opposite would be the type B, and this is the person who's much more easygoing. They're much more patient. They like, taking it easy and reflecting, and they'd rather have a peaceful, steady, quiet, and tranquil life as opposed to the highly driven, rigorous, competitive lifestyle. They don't get irritated easily. They're not as competitive. They don't see a need to hurry, right? Okay. Sometimes they might look lethargic or sluggish. They might look bored. They could be someone who likes to avoid stress, and therefore they might avoid new challenges. They tend to speak slower, or walk slower, or eat slower. And sometimes, they're looked at as apathetic because they don't really have the excitement or the enthusiasm and the dynamism that's required to perform at certain levels. So, all right. So what do you got for type A's? You live longer. So type A's, especially type A's with hostility, tend to die faster and die earlier. So yes, folks, maybe those of you who are type B's will get to go to my funeral, God forbid, right? Okay, but I don't have the hostility, like I said, but I am very high strung. Then we look at, PTSD and coping, and, how do we cope? How do we master, reduce, or tolerate the demands created by stress? What do you do in order to cope with the stress in your life? And, we can have different kinds of coping. We can have problem-focused coping where you actually deal with the problem. And then sometimes you have to resort to emotion-focused coping, which is where you change the way you feel about the problem. And students might ask me, well, when do you use either one? And I say, pretty much in my head, everything's problem focused. But there are certain things, obviously, that are out of your control. Like examples, maybe your parents fight a lot and they argue, and that's not within your control. You cannot control how your parents get along. So what you can control is how you respond to it. And so, learning how to manage your emotions when they're having an argument or when they're fighting is going to be very beneficial to you. So that's an example of emotion-focused coping. They put PTSD on this slide, and if you know anything about post-traumatic stress disorder, that is categorized a clinical severe anxiety disorder that involves intense fear. It involves anxiety, it involves avoidance, and it usually involves some very traumatic, distressing event. It could be something that happened once, or maybe that happened repeatedly, such as what our soldiers often face when they are at war. All right, and we have various defense mechanisms that we utilize according to the psychoanalytic perspective, right? We tend to defend ourselves with various defense mechanisms. And so those include rationalization, when you come up with some reasonable reasons for doing what you're doing, even though it's not the right thing to be doing. Right? And there's also denial, and that one's very frequently used. Oh yeah, no, nothing's happening. I'm okay, right? And you're twitching, but you're not okay, but you say you're okay, right? So that's an example of denial. And we have projection, and projection is where you project onto others the things that are going on in your head. So you start looking onto others. So maybe you're thinking of, maybe betraying or cheating in your relationship, but you start thinking you start looking at the other person like they're the ones who are wanting to. So who are you texting? What are you doing? Who was there? And you become very jealous and defensive, when in reality you're the one who's wanting to cheat. Right? Reaction formation is where you convert your feelings into exactly the opposite. So reaction formation is, that they ask you, how do you feel about your sister? And you're having a lot of issues and you're very resentful. But instead you say, I love my sister. And yeah, I'm just so glad that she's part of my life. And I'm so glad that, we get along, and etc. Repression is where he actually claimed that you would push the painful or the unwanted thoughts from your consciousness, and that you could actually, put them and repress them below the level of consciousness. Now, there's some empirical problems with this concept, because, if you've ever had something really bad happen to you, or something you're struggling with, you probably have it intruding into your life instead of actually being able to repress it. Sublimation is where you take this undesired emotion or feelings or desires, and you put them into something that's socially accepted. Like, well, I'm going to beat people up. I really want to beat up. I'm really hostile, so I'm going to go ahead and join boxing, or, karate, or whatever it is. And so that would be an example of sublimation. Regression is where you resort back to a previous life stage. So if you were, and if you remember oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital, those are Freud's stages, right? Psychosexual stages. So he believed that if you're facing something that's going on in your life, you might actually return to a previous life stage. So maybe you were at the phallic stage, but something's going on, so you resort now back to the anal stage. So that would be an example of regression. And then displacement is where you take out on others, on a more, a less threatening target. So for example, maybe you're really angry at your boss, but instead you go home and you take it out on your spouse, or you take it out on your kids or your dog. It's horrible, right? Okay, and so that's displacement. Right. Okay. And so that's that one always bothers me, because why don't you do it? Why don't you take it out on the person that's the threat? Well, because you know that there would be consequences. So sometimes what people do is they displace, and they take it out on a less threatening target. We differ, and men and women differ in how we deal with stress. Men are more likely to actually put up a fight when they're stressed out, and they're also more likely to, withdraw when they see that maybe their methods did not produce the results they wanted. Women tend to be more subtle about it, and they do something called tend and befriend. And so as they get stressed out, women tend to reach out for social support, right? And that's more of a female characteristic than a male characteristic. Men, like I said, they will withdraw, so they don't seek out the social support. So then sometimes they're very alienated when they're facing stress, and they don't reach out for help, almost like it's not, culturally acceptable for them to reach out for assistance. And so therefore, like for example, when they break off in a relationship, men do struggle more with depression, they struggle more with suicide. And so this could be part of it, right? Now, as far as, what affects the way you cope, some people just have a really strong hardiness about it. They can be very stress resistant, and they're able to, juggle multiple things, and they're able to not really see the harmful effects, even when they have a lot of stuff on their plate. So these are the 3 C's of hardiness. The first one is commitment, which means they tend to have a deeper involvement in their activities, such as their work or other life activities, as opposed to alienation, meaning just not really being part of it. They also feel control over those things. They feel they can influence the events, that they have control over the outcomes. And they also view things as challenges instead of threats, which means, when things get tough, they're like, okay, this is a new challenge, and I just need to step up to the plate, instead of, oh my gosh, this is going to threaten my livelihood and could be, the beginning of my demise kind of thing. Okay, so, and then we also have optimists, versus pessimists. Optimists do really well because they see the future as favorable, and they're more likely to engage in problem-focused coping, which I mentioned to you earlier. They're more likely to seek out social support, and they're also more likely to emphasize the positives, right? Okay, in the stressful events that are happening to them. Pessimists view the future as unfavorable, and they tend to engage in denial, right? Which I already mentioned to you is not a good thing. Some of the coping options that are listed in your book are sometimes maybe you just need to change the environment. That's one way you could cope, is get out, right? Okay, so if that's not an option, then change the environment, which means make it different. So if your workplace is really awful and horrible and stressful, you could just find a new job. That would be option number one here. Or you could try to make your workplace more friendly and more personable, right? Okay. Or the third one is change you. And how could you change so that it would be less stressful on your life? Does it involve cognitive appraisal differences? Does it involve emotion-focused coping? Right? Okay, so, and there's a lot of power to how we talk to ourselves. Dr. Ellis, Albert Ellis, was a great believer that what we say to ourselves about our experiences creates our reality. So the activating event, something happened, like there's a new boss at work, and how do you think of it? How do you believe? What are your beliefs about it? That he or she is going to be a terrible boss, that he or she is going to be an authoritarian and fire everybody. So how do you view it? And then that will equal the consequences and the feelings that you're having. So definitely your self-talk is a source of whether you are feeling stress or not. Then there's those irrational beliefs, right? And some people just think irrationally. Everyone's out to get me. It's not rational. First of all, because not everybody knows you, and secondly, because when we look at the natural bell curve of evil, right, versus good. And I always present that bell curve in class, and I always, talk about how we have some people who are excellent people, like friends. Let's look at our friends. We're gonna have a bell curve of friends, which means there's gonna be some people that are just amazing friends and will come and get you and make you chicken noodle soup when you're sick and just take care of you. They're amazing. And then there's those people that if you get a phone call or a text from them, once a year. And then there's the people that are happy in the middle. And so, for you to think everyone's terrible and everyone's, a cheater and everyone's horrible, those are all very irrational beliefs. So you have to learn how to ask questions like, is there any evidence for what I'm saying? Is there any proof? Is there any proof to support, what I'm claiming? And if so, is it sufficient? Is it sufficient proof, right? Okay, maybe it's just one example, and from one example you're generalizing, and then you need to be careful with that, right? Okay, so rational beliefs that actually have evidence and support are going to result in more appropriate emotions and behaviors than irrational beliefs. So, you question, are my beliefs rational or irrational? Also, are you walking around with all these like irrational statements that are part of your self-talk, like I should have done this, right? And these are absolutistic demands or moral imperatives, meaning if I was a good mother, I would have blank. If I was a good student, I should be blank. And there are these should statements that sometimes are very absolute, meaning you are not a good mother because blah, blah, blah. There's awfulizing statements that everything in the world is terrible or everything is awful. And, that just, awfulizing statements, looking at, someone and realizing they're not perfect, and from there you realize, well, you claim in your head that they're completely awful, and so that's again not a good way to be thinking, right? Okay, because that's again generalizing. And anytime you're saying all, every, none, never, always, everybody, no one. Those are all overgeneralizations. So those are some of the cues. And if you tend to use those a lot, it might be a sign that you are making a lot of irrational claims about your life. So how do we dispute these? Well, monitor how you react to things, right? And start writing it down. I know your generation doesn't believe in writing things down, so maybe put them on your phone. You can record yourself. Do something so that you're monitoring how you're reacting to things. Also, write down like what kind of things triggered, right? That led to that pleasant feeling. What led to that stressful condition? Record yourself talk. Record yourself out loud. Because sometimes you're not going to catch it until you hear yourself out loud and what you're saying to yourself, right? And then finally, going back to listening to yourself, go through and dispute your claims. Right? Is it rational or irrational what you're claiming? Does it make sense? Right? Is it including an overgeneralizing word? Is it something that is not working for your best interest? Right? Okay. And so there are many ways to manage your stress, right? Okay, there's over 20 tips, right? Okay, in your book. And I would hope you can familiarize yourself with them and at least be able to, jet out 5 of these. That you can reach for on a regular basis. Also, it'd be really nice for you to practice the relaxation response so that you can learn how to relax. Because, when you're stressed out, you're more likely to lash out. And so, if you have kids or, if you have challenging situation at work, you want to keep yourself, a healthy balance. Right? You want to be able to have that relaxation at your fingertips when you need it. All right, guys, I think I made it. Maybe I'm a little bit over by 10 minutes, but I hope you enjoyed the video. Send me any questions you might have for this next exam, and I'm wishing you the absolute best for exam number 3. Okay, everyone. Don't forget to complete the video survey, right? So you can get 2 points added to your scores. All right, bye, everybody.